Greetings, I'm Robert Bejesky, an assistant professor in economics and law at Mid-Michigan College. It's an honor to provide this presentation today. Much research and data are relied upon in this topic, but the use of the data, impressions, and conclusions are my own and shouldn't be construed to represent those of any institution or organization. I've entitled this presentation, Dr. Martin Luther King's Aspiration for Economic Equality in Today's Racial Wealth Gap. Dr. King was a brilliant advocate for the most critical of policy issues, and in emphasizing interactions among issues such as racism, economic exploitation, inequality, and business fairness. In this presentation, I'll focus on one critical aspect of Dr. King's advocacy that continues to resonate with the political and economic atmosphere in the country. Economic justice was at the forefront of Dr. Martin Luther King's vision for equality. The Black Lives Matter movement and the employment hardships surrounding the coronavirus pandemic highlight how economic equality has been difficult to attain. The economic recovery during the coronavirus pandemic has been called a K-shaped recovery, which refers to a V-shaped economic recovery for those with the highest levels of wealth. Those who sold equities and then re-entered the market at low levels reaped high returns. The 651 billionaires in the US saw their collective wealth grow by over $1 trillion in 2020. The downward shape of the stroke in the letter K refers to the people who are suffering today and out of work. A disproportionately high percentage of the economically disenfranchised due to the COVID pandemic are African Americans. Jacoba Williams, an associate economist at RAND, points out that Black workers are being hit especially hard from the coronavirus pandemic, just like they were during the Great Recession. It took over 10 years for their incomes to return to pre-recession levels. During the COVID pandemic, Black Americans lost jobs at a higher rate and are less likely to have wealth and savings to use during a period of unemployment. And those who have liquid assets may be more likely to exhaust their savings. Government assistance through stimulus packages and supplemental unemployment benefits have been critical to those hurt economically. Individuals at lower socioeconomic levels are more likely to face setbacks that are not felt by those at higher economic levels. I'll explore Dr. King's message of economic equality from the perspective of how the interaction of yearly income influences aggregate wealth for Black Americans. Many of Martin Luther King's speeches and writings sought to promote economic and employment equality for all poor people, although it was African Americans who were disproportionately impoverished. The public assistance and transfer payment programs of the 1960s and 1970s did reduce extremely high levels of poverty and helped address daily needs. And those programs did change the lives of many to improve prospects for success. However, economists and politicians are very split over whether fiscal policy programs can provide the structural foundation to drive true socioeconomic change towards more equality. Dr. King maintained that the economic system required systemic reform to overcome injustices. This graph reflects all the wealth of Americans: houses, buildings, businesses, stocks, bonds, bank accounts, etc. It's a time series perspective, as you can see on the horizontal axis. That can be said to represent what Dr. King understood about wealth in America. Granted, the time series starts with 1989 and runs to the present, but the same theme prevailed in the 1960s, although it was not quite as extreme. The richest 1% of Americans owned 23% of wealth in 1989, and that's grown to 31% today. The lowest level within that top 1% of households have net worth starting at about $10 million. The top 10% of wealth owners, which includes the top 1% plus the 9% below them, held 60% of the wealth in 1989 and almost 70% today. The lowest net worth within this 10% bracket starts at a little over $1 million. The bottom 50% owned 3.5% of wealth in 1989 and owns 2% today. Also notable is that the share of wealth held by the bottom 50% dropped to 0.4% in 2011 during the Great Recession. This further indicates the difficulties that the poor and middle class face during economic downturns. It means that the Great Recession dropped the net worth of the bottom 50% of wealth owners by about 80%, and it took a decade to creep back up to about 2%. A major reason that wealth inequality has grown from the 1960s to the present day is due to a substantial effective drop in tax rates on the wealthiest Americans. The top income earners were subject to a tax rate of between 45% and 70%, but it's now a little over 30%. Our tax brackets have become less progressive, and US inequality has increased faster than other highly industrialized democracies, as indicated by this graph. There's a fairly sharp increase after 1980. That's not surprising, as most European countries have had higher levels of progressive taxation and public spending than the US. With respect to the graph of wealth disparities, race distinctions are dramatic. the average wealth of a household in the United States with a head of household identifying as Black was $140,000 in assets, whereas the average wealth of the household with a white head of household was $901,000, which is 6.5 times greater. Data from the Survey of Consumer Finances collected 2 years before the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964 found that the average wealth of a white household was 7 times more than the average wealth of a Black household. When one uses median numbers, which is the middle instead of the averages, the monetary value is lower and the racial wealth gap is larger. That's because those at the top bring the averages within each bracket to a much higher level. The median numbers are more representative of the wealth held by the average American. A recent study by Darity et al. Using median household data of Black and white households found that the median Black household has accumulated just 10% of the value of the median wealth of the white household. That difference is $171,000 accumulated wealth by the median white household and $17,100 accumulated by the typical Black family. Dr. King addressed 2 clear perspectives regarding wealth disparity. He advocated for the most disenfranchised in society, which would be the bottom percentages of the wealth accumulation graph. And Dr. King expressed concern that the economic system structurally favored the rich. Wealth accumulation has become even more concentrated. On the first point, Dr. King's speeches and writings accentuated economic inequality, not just that faced predominantly by African Americans, but by the disenfranchised generally, and especially children living in poverty. In one example, in his sermon at Ebenezer Baptist Church in 1965, he stated, "I still dream that one day all of God's children will have food and clothing and material well-being for their bodies, culture and education for their minds, and freedom for their spirits." To examine poverty trends, the most commonly used indicator, and one that can be accurately employed over time, is the poverty rate set by the federal government. That's defined as 3 times the cost of providing an adequate diet. In today's dollars, for one person in a household, poverty rate's about $12,000. For a family of 4, it's about $20,000 a year in income. In his 1967 book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, Dr. King accentuated that national poverty was a problem faced by both poor white and Black Americans, of which 2/3 classified in poverty were white. But that's because the white population was over 8 times greater than the Black population in 1960. This graph from a White House source indicates that the poverty rate among Blacks was over 40% in the 1960s, which was over double the average of Americans generally. Prior to the coronavirus pandemic, the poverty rate for African Americans dropped to below 20%, but this is still about 2.5 times higher than the white population. Dr. King identified problems and offered solutions to reduce the rate of poverty. He attributed poverty to a lack of education, restricted job opportunities, a fragile family life, home lives that suppressed initiative and personal development, and a market economy prone to employment dislocations. In his book, he wrote that a national program was necessary to combat these socioeconomic ills, which he also believed would strengthen democracy because of the interrelationship between politics and economic well-being. He stated that we must have a dynamic guaranteed income, dignified employment, and overcome the variables causing the difficulties to reduce inequalities. We have come a long way in our understanding of human motivation and of the blind operation of our economic system. Now we realize that dislocations in the market operation of our economy and the prevalence of discrimination thrust people into idleness and bind them in constant or frequent unemployment against their will. He believed that the American economic system favored the wealthy and diminished the value and rights of the impoverished. Upward mobility wasn't as easy for Black Americans who found it more difficult to succeed in capitalism. In his eloquent "I Have a Dream" speech in Washington, D.C. in 1963, Dr. King accentuated that even with the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, issued by President Lincoln on January 1st, 1863, which stated that all persons held as slaves in the Confederate States would be free, 100 years later, there was still segregation and discrimination. Black Americans were left out of opportunities for material prosperity. There were obvious barriers to wealth accumulation during slavery and discrimination even after emancipation. The enactment of Jim Crow laws continued to impede Black entrepreneurs and economic prosperity. King's "I Have a Dream" speech praised the peaceful protests that led to positive change, recognized the difficulties of police brutality and injustice, and the need to facilitate more economic mobility and services, and accentuated a day when people of separate races would live in harmony and with freedom and justice. Economic equality is still central to positive change. A 2019 study by Alpranis and Carroll, senior research economist at the Federal Reserve Bank in Cleveland, assessed the persistent gap in wealth between blacks and whites and found, like most studies, that the disparities in wealth accumulation over time were mostly attributed to the income gap. Disposable income can be either saved or consumed. At lower levels of annual income, a higher percentage of income is consumed. If a lower percentage is saved per year, wealth accumulation will be lower. Tracing income differentials back to the 1960s, there's been a growing income gap between the very top and the rest of the population. Here's a graph. Of course, the difference with the graph representing the wealth gap is that the wealth differentials relates to assets accumulated over time. Here, income refers to total income earned in a year in the country, such as that stated on income tax returns. If the total American population is divided into percentages based on income earned each year, we can see that there's a disparity 60 years ago between the rich and the poor that's further increased. The red shading refers to the top 1% of income earners, which each year earned approximately 15% of the total national income. The top 10%, which are the orange and red colors together, received approximately 30% of the total income. Annual income of the bottom 90% decreased a bit, generally with cyclical and structural trends. Looking at this graph, there's been a fairly drastic upturn in annual income and improvement in wage equality since the time of Dr. King's advocacy. But based on Labor Department data, the median annual earnings of black men is generally about 20% lower than the median of all men. Black men and white women earn about the same amount at around $42,000. Meanwhile, black women earn less than everyone at $36,000. A portion of the reason for this differential is that men and women aged 25 and older, 34% of the white population had a college degree, and 24% of the black population had a college degree. The assumption in economics is that a business hires additional workers when the marginal benefit, which is the productivity as a measure of the value of the products and services sold, is greater than the marginal cost or wages of that employee. It's profitable to hire an additional worker. This is also the main reason certain jobs are compensated so much more than others. Sports stars and actors earn millions because of the market revenue that they generate, whereas the revenue generated from a minimum wage job is low and the ease of replacing the worker is high. In most job categories, it's higher education that qualifies one for the more highly compensated position. Take doctors, lawyers, engineers, computer experts, business executives, and other college-educated professionals. Improvements in the productive potential of workers can occur with higher education, more training, and motivation to produce more. Being out of work for a part of the year is another factor that can reduce annual income. Black Americans have consistently had a 4% to 8% higher unemployment rate than white Americans. There's also a substantial spike in unemployment during the COVID pandemic. The trends, of course, indicate economic cycles, and we would see other spikes in unemployment if the graph covered earlier decades. So how do these annual income disparities impact the drastic wealth accumulation inequalities represented in the first graph? Or more specifically, why is there such a high percentage of African Americans at lower levels of wealth? It's true that convergence of accumulated wealth will take a long time by the nature of what accumulation means. One can either save yearly income or receive a drastic increase, such as with a successful entrepreneurial project or win the lottery. This obviously will not happen to the entire population to drastically increase averages. But there are a couple of more common problems with assuming convergence of wealth will occur. The growth of any investment depends on the starting point of the principal and the return on investment. With respect to the starting principal, that's highly influenced by inheritances and wealth that's passed down. Scholars have, of course, noted that this is a reason for the persistence of the wealth gap between African Americans and the general population. Then there are the growth levels. In a 2004 study, Gittleman and Wolf found that investment portfolios held by Black households did earn a lower return on assets. People have different motivations for saving. Some reasons don't even necessarily seem like saving, such as with the purchase of a house, as increasing equity in the house is an alternative to renting, and people have to have somewhere to live. Households may also save for protecting against fluctuations in yearly income, to pay for the education of children, retirement, to increase future consumption, and other reasons. If wealth is passed to children and continues to accumulate, the impact of disparities and amounts could potentially not be as dominant. It's true that there hasn't been as much of a racial gap with the return on assets of non-portfolio or fixed assets held by African Americans, such as with the sale of businesses, real estate, vehicles, or returns on savings accounts. But the problem is that the stock market returns have been much higher than fixed assets, and Black households were not as historically invested in equities or the stock market as a percentage of assets. What do these statistics on income and closing the wealth gap mean for racial economic equality in terms of Dr. King's advocacy? It's difficult. In a recent article, the Washington Post noted that the issue of slavery reparations were introduced in a bill to study the issue 30 years ago, but has never reached a vote because it's been called the single most divisive idea in American politics. Reparations would be the equivalent of creating a higher initial principle for wealth growth. This was an issue that wasn't really circulating in Dr. King's day, but he criticized the US government for not providing land grants to African Americans in the Midwest when land was open to white farmers and similar matters. There have been local initiatives, such as with churches that sought to make donations to support Black religious communities, and also scholarships and other educational initiatives that provided scholarships to descendants of slavery. Reparations have been a politically controversial issue. Instead, without drastic change, the wealth gap could still close, but at a snail's pace. The Alapranis and Carroll study developed an economics model that extrapolated the statistics under the assumption that if the income gap would continue to close at the same rate that it did since 1962, there would also be a gradual closing of the wealth gap, but it would still take about 260 years. I have one further segment that addresses annual incomes and other structural issues to reduce poverty and increase racial equality that have been underway. The other gradual initiatives are to ensure that there are equal wages, including for gender and race and hiring, promotions and equal wages, assisting African Americans at the societal level to try to reduce incarceration rates and improving skills training. While the incarceration rate as a percentage of the African American population fell by 34% since 2006, 1/3 of the US prison population is presently Black. If someone's in prison, they're not earning wages, and there's not an ability to save. Future employment prospects will likely be reduced as a result of the criminal record, and descendants may be negatively impacted. Efforts should continue to be made at the societal and educational level to improve prospects for a successful future. Research further confirms that poverty is highly correlated with the commission of criminal offenses. Variables are interrelated. And if poverty influences health, well-being, mental health, and educational development, more efforts should be made to reduce poverty. Dr. King did advocate in his 1967 book, Where We Go From Here, that there should be a guaranteed income to solve the problem of poverty, but without accentuating a racial divide. Versions of a guaranteed income have been advocated by Senator Bernie Sanders and Democratic candidate for President Andrew Yang. The quality of public schools is important. Public schools in predominantly Black areas have been of lower quality than public schools in predominantly white areas. Better public schools should improve the economic prospects for Black children and teenagers and set them on the right track to a college education. Black entrepreneurship should be encouraged so that Black Americans can successfully start businesses. This requires financing. Discrimination in lending should be addressed. Recent Federal Reserve statistics found that African Americans are twice as likely to be turned down for bank loans. These are just some of the gradual policies that can therefore increase annual income and therefore wealth over time. They're also all issues that Dr. King accentuated. What's clear is that African Americans have made tremendous progress, and Dr. King was instrumental in pushing for change and serving as an icon for change. Imagine the issues that he battled with. Government policies at the state and local level promoting discrimination, segregation, and lower wages for Black employees. Today, there's a better foundation for equal opportunities, and a higher percentage of the population has a better likelihood of success prior to adulthood that can increase the percentage of African Americans who attain college degrees. With a gradualist market approach to wealth attainment that currently exists, improvements have been made. Dr. King and other racial equality leaders have been essential to that progress, but there's more to do. It was a pleasure for me to provide this presentation and an honor to interpret Dr. King's message in light of the trying circumstances of today's world. His message for equality and commiseration are very important. Please feel free to contact me at my email address. Stay safe and well. Thank you.